Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. Today on the podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Valerie Hudson. Valerie is a University Distinguished Professor. She holds the George H.W. Bush Chair in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, where she directs the program on women, peace, and security. Her co-authored books include Bare Branches, The Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population, Sex and World Peace, The Hillary Doctrine, and her new book is The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. She's a co-founder and principal investigator of the Woman Stats Project. Valerie, welcome to my podcast.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Oh, it's so wonderful to speak to you. And it's not my first time. You and I have spoken several times. You've contributed to my book, Pray. And I've just finished reading your fascinating book, The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. And I think that this book has to be read by absolutely everyone, especially those people who are in charge, or whether we've elected them or whether they're self-appointed, who are in charge of making decisions that have consequences for large swaths of society.
Thank you so much. That's music to an author's ear.
Of course. And I really mean it. This is really an important book. But Valerie, before we start, I wanted us to exchange our life stories. Mine has been around for a while, and I think it'll help set up this conversation if you tell me a little bit about your childhood, the kind of family you grew up in, what it was like to be a girl in that family, and what it was like to be female in that society, in your society, which is now mine.
Well, thank you. I rarely reflect upon that, and perhaps I should do it more often. I grew up on the East Coast, largely around the Washington, D.C. area, but we also spent some time in near Hartford, Connecticut. It was a second marriage for both of my parents. My mother was a second generation immigrant from Italy, and my father's family was English and had been in the country since the mid-1800s. And so originally, I think they married within their own ethnic communities. But because the time period of the 50s, people still looked askance at divorced people. They, in a sense, that freed them to find someone who was not necessarily from their community. So they married in a Unitarian church because they couldn't marry in a Catholic church for my mother's family, and they couldn't marry in an Episcopal church for my father's family. And it was very interesting. I was baptized both Episcopalian and Roman Catholic. And I apparently at some point, my parents decided that they would be better off just not listening to their families. So I grew up basically without knowing any of my extended family. I didn't know my uncles, my aunts, my grandmothers, my grandfathers. I didn't know them at all. My parents did a uniquely American thing, which is they wanted to completely reinvent themselves away from the influence of their family. I think in some senses that worked. I felt like I grew up without any real expectations from either side of the family as to what a woman should be. It was only my brother and I. My brother was 3 years younger than I was. Unfortunately, however, my parents were, as individuals, not prepared to totally carry off this social experiment. My father became an alcoholic and addicted to gambling, and eventually disappeared. I don't even know if he's dead or alive. He was caught embezzling funds from his family and totally skipped town shortly before my 16th birthday. And in those days, doctors alleviated stress by prescribing hardcore drugs. So my poor mother became addicted to Valium and other barbiturates that they'd given her, and that did nothing for her mental health. Right. So I, in turn, escaped very early. I graduated high school when I was 16, and I left for college, and I went to Utah for college. So I got away and reinvented myself. And so I've had a very interesting life. For example, I think, I'm going to make a claim, and I'm sure someone will prove me wrong, but I think that I am the only person that served in a special forces unit and was also a La Leche League leader.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad we're talking about it like this. So 2 questions. 1, what happened to your brother?
My brother is actually a prosperous businessman in Silver Spring, Maryland, and he's doing really well. But it is true that when I left for school, he had an awful several years trying to deal with the nuclear fallout from my family's collapse.
Right. And second question, who paid for your college?
Well, actually, that is a really interesting question.
And his college tuition, yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting story. I was valedictorian. I graduated at 16, and I had my sights set on Johns Hopkins. That's where I wanted to go. And my mother, as part of her interesting mental journey, had decided to get us baptized into a church, right? So it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she had also taken us around to many other religions at the time. This is all going to make sense in just a minute. So in that church, they have assigned kind of ministering families who kind of help other families out. And boy, did my family need help. And knowing of my desire to go to college, they said, well, you promise us you at least apply to Brigham Young University. Even if you're going to Johns Hopkins, just apply to Brigham Young University. So I agreed and applied. And so my father, who was still paying the bulk of, our house payment and everything every month after the divorce, he disappeared a few weeks before I graduated from high school. So I got the top scholarship that was available at Johns Hopkins, which was half tuition. Oh. And I got a full ride scholarship plus a stipend plus textbooks at Brigham Young University.
So you went to Brigham.
So totally not in my game plan for my life. I ended up at Brigham Young University. So that's actually a really interesting story of how I ended up where I was.
Yeah. So the Mormons are way more generous than Michael Bloomberg.
Yes.
It is, we're laughing, but it really is quite the story, and probably quite the story for most Americans.
Yeah, I think there is a sense in which America is a place where you can reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
So, troubling traditions or harmful practices from your ethnic community need not necessarily, continue, into the future. But I think it does take a strong will for immigrants, especially my mother, to say, I'm walking away from that. And I think they did have to move to the Washington, D.C. area to really get away from their family. They were born and raised in New York City.
Yeah.
So that's how they managed to affect that change.
So they made these individual choices for one another to leave their ethnic communities, their first spouses, start all over again for themselves. And then would you, looking back, describe them as failures, or would that be really too harsh a label to pin on them?
It's kind of a double thing. I'm actually grateful to them for having broken away. I am. And I don't think that I would be who I am today if they had not made the choice to break away. I really don't.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, clearly, as individuals, they had some individual failings, which meant that I think they kind of imploded the family that they had hoped to create, which I imagine was the project they had in mind when they left their communities in the first place. So it's a kind of a mixed story, I think, of success and personal failure.
And it's a success insofar as you and your brother are, by my standards, huge successes.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Yeah, my brother and I occasionally do look at each other and go, so, like, how did we survive that apocalypse? But I can tell you that we definitely do, have some legacy. We're vigilant people. We don't take anything for granted. We don't trust easily. I think there's an experience that comes with that kind of thing that kind of strips the rose-colored glasses from off your eyes.
Yeah. And I think as you describe this background, again, obviously I'm referencing my own background. I also came from a broken family, and I couldn't break away. The consequence of breaking away was, if you break away, there'll be violence. There'll be the honor of the family will be broken. You'll bring shame upon us, and we're not going to tolerate that. And I know that if my brother had broken away, that it would have been different. And what I find fascinating, it never stops fascinating me, is that when you describe the story of your brother and yourself, there's really no difference in the way you were treated in, your parental home and beyond. Or is there?
I really can't look back and think of any difference. The only difference I know is that I was closer to my father, and my brother never felt close to my father. And I have no idea where that came from or what happened, but yeah, I don't think there was really any difference. I think my brother did suffer from having a high-achieving older sister, because they were always looking at him and how come your grades are this way and your sister's grades are that way? So I think he probably had a bit of an affliction from having me as an older sister.
Yeah, but
that was my ticket out, right?
Yeah,
and I think you can relate to this,
yes,
right? Which is the power of the mind, and the fact that, nothing's a perfect meritocracy, but certainly I think in the realm of ideas, there may be greater space, I think, for a woman to make her mark, or at least perhaps just in my field of study. But I think there is a greater room, all right, than there otherwise might be.
So you broke away and you went to the university that you went to, Birmingham and Young, and it's in Utah, and your scholarship is paid for with Mormon money, and there are all these stories about Mormons and how they are exactly, they're polygamous, they are religious, they're compared to the parts of the world that I come from. Since you know both sides, and being an outsider and insider in that community, would you describe it as something that's uniquely American and very different from Somalia and Afghanistan and all the other places where polygamy takes place, or would you say it's an anomaly within American society, American culture? And I think what's even more mystifying is if they are so religious and so primitive and so polygamous, why would they give scholarships to girls?
Oh, well, let me just first say right off the bat that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially stopped the practice of polygamy in 1890 and has excommunicated anybody attempting to practice polygamy or even preaching that polygamy is something that, is important to God. So the stories about Mormon polygamists that you see in the news are actually splinter groups, all of whom are not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at all. And in fact, if the Supreme Court legalized polygamy tomorrow, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would still refuse to baptize or would excommunicate anybody who wanted to practice polygamy. That's just the way it is. So that whole polygamist thing, I think, is just a total, red herring. What's not a red herring, and of course what was really hard for me, I'd never been off the East Coast in my life, and there I was in Provo, Utah. It was the worst culture shock. Well, who am I talking to? I'm sure you had worse culture shocks, but let me tell you, for me, it was it took me years to recover from the shock. It was just, it was a world that I had never even dreamt of in my life. And I will tell you that even though I arrived at Brigham Young University as someone who didn't really believe in the church, I'd been, if you will, forced to be baptized in the church by my mother, that by the time, about 13 years later, right, I could say that I was really a believing member of the church, and I am today. But so one of the things that I found very troubling, and which sort of turned me into one of those Mormon feminists, was that there was still this interesting legacy, which I think was tied up with polygamy, right, about the place of women and the idea that maybe women were somehow lesser creations or something, or that men were more important than women and men should rule and so forth and so on. Fortunately, I have lived in a time, and I have actually made efforts myself to try to change this culture. There is a revolutionary doctrine, which is that God is not an old bachelor, that in fact he's an old married man, and that not only do we have a heavenly Father, but we have a heavenly Mother, and they rule the heavens together as equals. And so you can imagine with a doctrine as kind of revolutionary as that among the Christianities, that there is space for a robust, feminist conception of life, of what we're doing here, what we're supposed to be doing while we're here, and where we're going in the next life. And so that's actually been, really a joy in my life, is as a Mormon feminist and a scholar, is to try to increase and grow that space for real equality between men and women in a religious tradition that was very patriarchal. And I know there's many wonderful groups doing that in Islam as well. I think of Sisters in Islam and others that have made, I think, similar inroads and shown the true beauty, or the true potential beauty, right, of a religion that was once seen solely in patriarchal terms.
The word patriarchal and patriarchy is thrown about a lot. And it's become one of those container phrases, catchphrases that means whatever to whoever. And there are so many of those words today in our society. What does it mean to you, and what exactly would you describe? How would you describe, if you're an anthropologist, what is a patriarchal society?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think our book tries to approach what we consider to be kind of a more, well, let's say a less amorphous type of definition. What we look at as patriarchy is that throughout human history, right? If you kind of go back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 5,000 years, what you're going to find is that virtually all communities are run by extended male kin groups, right? These days we might call them clans or tribes, but back then that was simply the governance structure. Right. And in those male kin groups, right, were the ones that were responsible for defending the group against out-group threats, threats from other male kin groups. But it's also true that if you want to create this kind of, fraternity, if you will, at the heart of your society and make it the most powerful force in the society, you're going to get some nasty consequences. And one of those nasty consequences is that the interests of females in the group will be strictly subordinated to the interests of males in the group. And I still think of that as a sort of a nice general purpose definition of patriarchy. Whatever matters to women will always, by definition, be less important than what matters to men. And men, of course, enforce this through violence. And so even today, we have societies where, surveys in Afghanistan have shown 87% of Afghan women experiencing violence in the home. And it is also accompanied by structures that, if you will, kind of disempower women right off the bat, right? So when you have child marriage, where girls of 12 or 13 are married off to men of 25 and 26, right? That's a structural way of making sure that she is less powerful than he is. When you deny girls property rights, inheritance rights, when they can't own land or they have no recourse to say, hey, I should inherit from my parents as well as my brothers. That's another way of really disempowering women. When you create family law, where it's easy for a man to divorce his wife, but almost impossible for a woman to divorce her husband, you've built in, right, something that will very powerfully subordinate her. When you say children are the property of the father, so if the woman wants to divorce her husband, she has to leave her children behind. That's a powerful way, if you will, of subordinating women. So I see patriarchy as the means by which men make sure that women's interests are subordinate to men's interests in the society.
To play the devil's advocate, a man in a tribal society or in a clan community or in the family will say, well, first of all, this is how everybody lives and has. This is nature. It's not men against women. It's just the way God wanted it or nature wanted it or whatever. Number one. And then number two, they will also say, well, it's really protecting the women and the children. We fight as men. We get killed. We hunt. We are the ones who bring the food back. So this whole story about you guys being oppressed, get over it. What would you say to those people?
Well,
that's what I've been told all my life.
I would laugh. All right, so let's take your second point first, right?
Yeah.
Which is that women in these societies are more protected than they are in other societies. That's a joke. We even did an empirical study of this, right? Is we actually looked at levels of violence against women compared to how quote unquote protected they were by clans and tribes. And of course, the highest levels of violence in the world are against women who are in these clan and tribal societies. There is no protection to women.
Let me tell you, I can show you when I was living in my Somali clan and family. In 1990, I was in Mogadishu, Somalia, and it was breaking apart. My mother, who was in Nairobi, demanded I was 20 years old. My sister, 18, she said, I want my daughters back. We didn't grow up in Mogadishu. I want my daughters back here, she told the extended family, because the news I'm getting from Somalia is absolutely terrible. So they sent us back to Nairobi. And then a few months later, when the civil war broke out, and this is happening I left in November, civil war broke out in January, I go back to the border between Kenya and Somalia. And there I find that, you know, the refugees, the people who fled Somalia because of the civil war, because of that breakdown, they were exposed to the elements. They were exposed to hunger. They were exposed to all the trials and tribulations you can imagine of a breakdown of society. But the women in that context were not only exposed to what everything and everybody else was exposed to, they were exposed also to rape and sexual oppression, and they were dying like flies. And when I posed the question, what happened to all that male protection? Where did it go? The answer is complicated. Lots of men died fighting the other side, whatever the other side was. But even the remaining ones were actually exploiting and raping the women that they were supposed to protect.
Actually, you've put your finger on something that we talk about in our book, which is the greater sense of distress or threat a man feels, the worse women will be treated. And we have found that to be true across, civilizations and so forth, is
right.
That the way of coping with this external threat is to even more fiercely control and exploit women. And it's really unfortunate. Your first point, I do want to get back to your first point, which is when they tell you this is all natural and this is what God wants. I mean, one of the huge takeaways from our book is that we can show you that if what you do to your women, you do to your group, you do to your clan, you do to your nation state. So if you curse women, if you exploit women, if you harm women, you end up with hugely, significantly worse outcomes for your group. Absolutely. It's almost as if, and here I will put it back in their laps, it is almost as if God curses you for cursing your women. So I think it's a law of God that you could say to these gentlemen that it is a law of God that if you treat women well, God will bless you. But certainly if you treat women poorly, God will curse you, and you will have instability, conflict, terrorism, autocracy, economic decline, exploitation, worse environment. You name it, we show in our book that you will have worse if you treat your women badly.
And worse than that, it'll also be a cycle. It will keep repeating itself over and over again, and it will seem like you can never get out of that. I saw a small slice of that when I came to the Netherlands, and I found the societies, in this case, Somalis pouring into Holland, a tiny European country, 6 feet under sea level, and the people with whom I shared the campus, asylum seekers campus, that the Dutch so generously provided for us, kept on complaining, how on earth can we be in the custody of infidels? And the infidels seemed to be doing very, very well. And so the people that God had forsaken, that's what I was being told, God had forsaken the infidels, and God would burn them in hell. They had sinned and they were sinning. Their women were uncovered and completely intermingling with men. That society seemed to be so wealthy, so stable, so powerful. And so I don't even need to be convinced. I was asking those questions back then. Oh, what is it that they're doing right? What is it that we're doing wrong? And so by the time, years later, I start reading John Stuart Mill, and I get a systematic answer, an attempt at a rigorous answer to the question, why do some societies succeed and others fail? And this is what I'm finding in your book. I think more and more people have now reached that conclusion. But the key question is, and this is to go back again to some of the more important points, perhaps the most important point in your book is, what is it that happens if we're all tribal? You know, you start with the quote from Yuval Noah Harari, and he says, his book is first of all titled Sapiens, which I think is the most politically correct title you could find. But anyway, he notes that throughout human history, the hierarchy of supreme importance in all non-human societies, the hierarchy of sex, and then he continues to explain that. And you describe how that is, we all lived like that, regardless of whatever religions, backgrounds, geographical locations. The key question is what happened? Why did some break through and others remained in that primitive cycle?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because the last part of our book is all about change. You know, we created an index that allowed us to see how many of these subordinative practices still existed within the society. And one of the most striking findings is that there was a real spectrum, right? We had, it was a 0 to 16 scale. We had some countries that were 1s, and we had one country that was a 16, but we had plenty of countries that were 15s and 14s. No, it wasn't Somalia. It was actually South Sudan. So I think Somalia is 15 and South Sudan is 16. But, it was interesting to us that if you had done that same map, 1,000 years ago, they'd all be 16s, right? But now, right, in the 21st century, there's an actual variety of practices concerning women. And you were absolutely right. If you mapped, who's wealthy, healthy, and stable vis-a-vis how women are treated, it's just almost a one-to-one correspondence. It goes back to that quote-unquote law of God that I was talking about, right? But we were really interested in your question, which is how the heck did this change? And of course, it first changed for women in Northwestern Europe, right? That's where we start to see some real interesting changes for women. And it ironically had to do with the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was definitely not in the business of
empowering women.
All right, let's just get that right off the bat. All right, but they were interested in empowering themselves. Okay, and so
now we're going to finish each other's sentences. Okay, I'll stop.
So now there were some things, from sort of Christian law that helped right off the bat. All right, so. They said female infanticide, you'd burn in hell. They said polygamy, nope. And they said cousin marriage, nope, that's incest. Okay, so right off the bat, 3 really awful things, for women, female infanticide, polygamy, and cousin marriage were off the table, right? Yep. Just because you're Christian. And that actually caused a lot of consternation, which we talk about in our book. Because just like in every other society, these things were used, right, to make sure that men prospered. But then the church went further, okay? And what the church did was it promoted the rights of widows to inherit their husband's property. So instead of widows being forced to marry some brother of the deceased man, the church upheld the widow's rights to hold on to their property. The church disinherited illegitimate sons. I mean, you see how this is starting to really mess with this whole sort of clan, male, land-holding kind of paradigm here. Now, the church didn't do that because it wanted rich widows. The church did this because the deal was the deal they gave to rich widows was, we will protect you. That is, we will put you up in a convent or an abbey. We will make sure that you're protected from your husband's relatives. And in return, you're going to give us his money and lands.
Of course. What a great deal. It's like it's made in Hollywood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the fact that women were given the right to inheritance also trickled down, right? So even though their eye was on the prize of the rich women, right, it really helped. Another thing that happened, and this I think was really crucial in addition to property rights, was that in Northwestern Europe, there arose a set of laws which incentivized keeping your daughters in the household till they were older. That is to say, you got tax-free, or you were allowed to hold more land if your household was bigger. And so instead of marrying their girls off at 12, 13, 14, in Northwestern Europe, they began marrying their daughters off at 22, 23 to boys who were 24, 25. Yeah. So instead of a 12-year-old married to a 24-year-old, you had a 22-year-old married to a 24-year-old.
Yeah.
And the types of marriages that were created were just a world apart from the types of marriages that had existed across the globe to that point. So this weird, unique path of later marriage for girls, property rights for widows, no polygamy, no cousin marriage, no lots of other things, no female infanticide, was just a world paradigm shattering historical occurrence for male-female relations, and ushered in, right, things like capitalism and democracy, which also began in Northwestern Europe, and some have attributed to this paradigm shattering change for women.
And could one of the effects, I mean, you can imagine there were a number of very, very important effects, but could a small effect maybe that people lived a fraction longer?
Yes, that's right. Because they were living, instead of dying at 40, they began dying at 50. All right, that changed things too. I agree with that.
And mother mortality, instead of, you're a 12-year-old and you're pregnant, 13-year-old, you're pregnant, and obviously mother and child die faster than if your body is developed and is mature enough for childbearing.
That's exactly right. And the education of the children differs. When
Absolutely.
A 14-year-old is having kids, what kind of investment can she make in their education? Not very much. But if she's 22 and she's been out in the world, she becomes a real asset to her child. And what you find is many of the great inventors and the great, thinkers and scientists had mothers who were of an age that they could really concentrate on the education of their children. So this amazing increased investment in children by mothers who are now adults instead of children themselves is part of that virtuous cycle. So the next generation does better than your generation, not the same or worse than your generation.
And the men who were disempowered by those revolutionary changes, how did they respond to that?
Oh, they hated it.
Of course.
Of course they hated it and they fought it. What was kind of fun, right, is that they were deemed as fighting against God, right? And that's really what's needed in certain other religious traditions as well, is to get to the point where it is recognized that God actually wants you to treat women well and will bless you if you do. That's the kind of thing that happened there. So rich men, powerful men, face the threat of excommunication from the church, eternal damnation, and loss of their power and wealth. Because if you were excommunicated, the church could seize your lands and your property.
So if we compare that to, say, Islam, what I see today is that the narrative was seized by the men, the people we now call radicals and extremists. So we've got all sorts of labels for them. But they seized the narrative of, if you will, the church. There is no church in Islam, but the narrative that they are spokespeople for God. And so they then have enshrined in law, in tradition, in custom, in norms, everything that we had been talking about: the subordination of women, child marriage, polygamy, the supremacy of the male. How do you break out of something like that?
That's a really good question. As someone who is a believer herself, right? I'm a very keen observer at things that have happened in other religious traditions, because in every religious tradition you will find women who say, no, this can't be right. We see these horrible, horrible outcomes in our society from the interpretation that God is just like a guy, right?
Right.
And that God is okay with domestic violence, or God is okay if, men come first. We can see the horrible, horrible outcomes, and we don't think God actually likes these horrible outcomes for society. So we must have gotten that wrong, right? We must have gotten that wrong. Otherwise, then God must hate us all to so curse our societies with these horrible outcomes. And so I do believe that there's women in every religious tradition that's saying, can we peel back, right, these very male interpretations and assumptions, and can we try to resurrect what really was meant? For example, I just read a book. I'm not in the evangelical tradition, but I just read a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, by I think it's Alison Barr, who argues that Paul's, whose writings have been appealed to by misogynists in Christianity as sort of blessing the subordination of women, and said, look, we've got this completely wrong. That's not what Paul meant at all. This is what Paul was fighting against. Let's go back to the original and let's see what possible interpretations there are. So there's women in the evangelical world, there's women in Islam, there's women in Roman Catholicism, there's women everywhere who are saying that the male lens on God has perverted what was really meant. And we know this is true because we can see the horrible outcomes in our communities of subordinating women.
And there are women also in the secular realm. So a lot of women who are born within the Islamic tradition, whether they're in Iran, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, Afghanistan, parts of Muslim Africa, they are actually saying exactly what you are saying, and they're noting the differences. As I couldn't look away, I mean, I saw Holland, and my God, they are way more powerful, wealthier, more stable, more friendly. These are countries that we are pouring into as Muslims, and they are the infidels, and they're doing well. So they're making a case about secularity and saying, let's just leave religion aside, or let's at least leave religion outside of some things. Let's leave religion out of politics, religion out of science, and empower women. And maybe there you find a coalition between, I would say, secular communities and people who believe in that secular narrative, and people from religious communities as a way of exploring an option that is win-win for women, but then also for all of humanity, because if those women are treated better, not forced into child marriage, not female genital mutilation, all of these terrible things that are done to women, that their societies will improve.
Yes.
And so it's not just a religious story, it's in fact maybe even a secular story.
That's right. And in fact, you can run, if you will, a religious experiment. For example, in I'm not an expert on Islam, but God doesn't command you to beat your wife. God doesn't command you to take 4 wives. So you could be a good Muslim and not do those things. And then we could see how your family turns out compared to other families where the excuse is God's okay if I beat my wife, God's okay if I take 4 wives. And we could see over time whether a good Muslim who decides not to do those things ends up with a better situation than those who do.
So for clarity, so people who will be listening to this podcast will say, wait a second, it does say in the Quran that you can take 4 wives. It does say in the Quran that you can beat your wife. And that is true.
But it doesn't say you have to.
Exactly. It does say you have permission under certain circumstances to beat your wife, but you don't have to. So yes, there is an opt-out.
There's room for an experiment, and
there's
it might
room
be a
for
crucial
an experiment. Yeah. So I think it is so important that we are just really honest about what these traditional books that were written 1400 years ago. That's how people lived back then. That's how things were done. But there is an opening even within Islam to do things differently. Yes. Now I'm going to ask you the last set of questions. And they're going to be a little bit tricky, and we don't have that much time left. But I will go ahead and ask. You're a man from Afghanistan or Somalia or whatever, and you have the power to have as many wives as you want, to marry your cousin, and whoever disobeys, you can beat her up, and you have all of this stuff. And you don't really care about what the world is going to look like, your community, the world is going to look like sometime in the future. You're being asked to give all of this up. You're looking at societies in Europe. And what you see is this. You see an aged society. You see a society where people are voluntarily, yes, they're wealthy, yes, they have stable societies and so on, but they have decided they don't want to have children anymore. They look tired. They are not really engaged with the world. There is no potential. I'm just thinking from the perspective, and I have had this over and over again. It's not exciting or appealing for a young man who comes from a society that may be poor, but thrilling, to adopt the lifestyles of these. I remember one American scholar calling Europe an open-air museum. What has gone wrong? What happened?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question because in other work, right, I've written about that as well. And I do not believe that Western societies are immune from this law that we've been talking about. I do believe that there are weaknesses in the Western model concerning male-female relations that do lead to this senescence, if you will, this museum-like quality that we're thinking. And I think it is extremely important that we stand up against it. There are many, many roots, I think, of that senescence. Right? I think one is that the bargain between men and women has broken down. If you will, the peace treaty between men and women has broken down. And that peace treaty, I think, was meant to be monogamous, faithful marriage, to be perfectly blunt. And that has broken down. We see the absolute ubiquity of porn. I was just reading the other day that in a recent survey of college-age men in the United States, 99% admit to accessing porn within the last month, and 48% access it every day. Every day.
Yeah.
And we know that the porn of today is not like some glamorous model in a sheer negligee. All right. Now we have normalize sexual practices that include punching, strangling, hitting women during sex. I think that the whole idea that you would have sex with someone that you have no iota of feeling or commitment to. I think that as we've sort of, if you will, turned male-female relations into sort of a boundaryless kind of free-for-all, that men
and is that retrogression? Is it going back thousands of years in these fantasies, in just that particular type of porn that you're describing? Is it like going back into women just
I don't know what kind of porn they had back in history, but I do know.
No, but that is how women were seen. They were seen
right.
basically, they were treated,
yes.
They had no value, or they were
no
a commodity
value.
in a different way.
They could be killed, they could be harmed, and if that woman belonged to you, there were no legal consequences to you at all. So I do see it as a retrogression where, if you will, men's rights to sex, on their terms, without any commitment, without any love, without any respect, has destroyed, I think, male-female relations. And I think that we have a generation of young women who take one look at what 99% of young men are consuming, and they say, if that's what being a woman is, I want no part of it at all. And I don't blame them one bit.
And so this is maybe, what would you say, a deviant? I'm not a sociologist, but that's the type of language they use. Words like deviance, deviating from, the norm. And these deviances, this type of, from the time I really started to think about pornography, I reached the conclusion, but this is very subjective on my part, that it is an expression of not love, not sex, but supreme loneliness.
Yeah.
The man or the woman who wants to engage in that type of behavior with someone they've never met and be that cruel and desire such things and fantasize about strangulations and that kind of cruelty are very, very lonely people. And a lot of philosophers say that the problem with our modern free and wealthy and stable society is we've never been able to deal with that side effect, the unintended consequence, which is loneliness. And so you get all of these deviations, you get all of these madnesses. There are no genders. There can be
is no sex.
There's no sex. Yeah, exactly. Let's just blow the whole thing up.
Yeah, that's clearly not the case. This is not going to bring us in the long term what we desire, right? Freedom and happiness and dignity of the individual. All those things are being erased as we erase all of those boundaries concerning women and concerning children. There's been a very worrying uptick in the idea that children have rights to sexual expression adults have rights to sexual expression with children. These are things that destroy your civilization. So I can certainly, I have great sympathy for the man in Afghanistan who says, I don't want my country to become like that.
Yeah.
Right, so is it possible that we humans could come up with a nice middle ground where we did not erase all boundaries, but at the same time, we did not subordinate women? That's the top question in my mind. Is such a society possible? Mm-hmm. Because if it's not possible, then you will have the world that you see today, where part of the world is growing old and dying off, and the other part of the world is filled with violence and cruelty and terror. How is it that those are our only two possible options? Well, the answer is the first political order that you choose, the order that you establish between men and women. And that's why our book is called The First Political Order.
And that first political order has to be then based on love, and that love is to entice, to seduce the societies that are still tied to primitive institutions, to venture into the land of change, and those that have changed and have seen that progress, to cling on to what was good and right about those changes and not throw it all away. That is the fight of the 21st, the cultural fight of the 21st century.
That's beautifully expressed. That's exactly how I see it as well.
Thank you so much for coming to this podcast. And I think with people like you, we will succeed. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything. Thank you for your honesty.
Well, thank you. Actually, you were a formative influence. I read your very first book, and it was something that expanded my mind and helped me begin to think about these systematic ways in which women are subordinated and why those practices are chosen and what effects they may have. So I'm very grateful for your corpus of work.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the podcast. If you're enjoying these conversations, please rate and review them on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.